Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today. The topic today is Fueled is Fast, and it fills me with delight to be able to talk about this and the campaign that we've done with Feisty Media to really sort of bring to the attention what I think is an issue amongst certain part of the population of endurance athletes and certainly triathletes and Ironman athletes. And so I think today's talk is we will go through obviously the etiology and signs and symptoms of low energy availability and RED-S, Relative Energy Deficiency in sport. Yet I think the big focus is hearing from some athletes who have suffered from this condition, and also talk about the real world sort of implications of it and what can be done to hopefully avoid it and when to understand when you have got it. So without further ado, we will get into this talk. So my name's Scott Tyndall. I'm one of the founders of Fuelin. My background is in health and performance. I've worked with many professional sporting organizations and have worked with Ironman and triathletes since 2017. That's enough about me.
Elizabeth Infine. Looking at the list, I already know a lot of you guys, like Scott, focus on health and performance mostly in endurance sports, especially where female nutrition is concerned, and really spreading the message about proper fueling and kind of the effects that can have on performance.
Perfect. So as we discussed, we're going to talk about LEA and RED-S, and then we're going to talk about RED-S and a bit of overtraining syndrome and sort of the link between everything. And so give people a clear understanding of when these conditions can occur, despite the complexity of them, but then really focus on some personal stories from Elizabeth and also Danny Treese, who's a professional athlete who's joining us today. And then we also have some questions from current members of the athlete program and also members of the public who sent in some questions related to LEA and RED-S, which we wanted to try and address. I just want to sort of put these two references in particular out there. People can search these. I believe they are free access to the entire articles you can get, and we will provide a PDF for everyone who joins the talk today and share that, and we'll share that with Feisty Media as well. So this image of Elizabeth, we've seen on Instagram before. We've talked about it. Yeah, quite often I think people would comment and say, wow, she looks amazing, and do the on fire emojis and things like that. But as Elizabeth has talked about, this is probably when she was actually at her lowest and not feeling the best. So we did want to highlight that as something just to think about in that sense. So in terms of low energy availability, as has been discussed on many of the podcasts with Feisty last week and this week, is low energy availability really more often than not underpins, that female athletic triad and ultimately RED-S, Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome. So what does it mean by being in low energy availability? Technically speaking, it's lower than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. And we're going to give some examples of what that may actually look like, because it is very important for, I think, everyone out there to understand that you can go into a caloric deficit without going into potentially low energy availability. And that's something really important to understand. For men, it's very unclear as to what that low energy availability sort of threshold is. Some of the literature will throw out that it's around 15 calories, but there certainly is men out there only consuming up to 10 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. Low energy availability can become intentional, i.e. avoiding eating, because that's what the athlete is trying to do on purpose. It can be unintentional, though, whereby they don't understand the amount of energy required to meet their training demands. So that is something that's very important as well. It's not always an intentional eating disorder or disordered eating. Sometimes it is unintentional. And then the other complexity to that is could be intentional, unintentional low energy availability. So what that means is you're intentionally avoiding gluten or carbohydrates, for instance, and unintentionally that is going to push you into low energy availability. And that is something that I think has happened probably far more for especially females due to a lot of the misnomers around carbohydrates and how they will make you fat. I think intake versus expenditure, ultimately that's the sort of equation, and we'll show that equation. But if your intake is less than your expenditure, you're potentially heading towards, you're certainly going to be in a caloric deficit, and you could be heading towards low energy availability. Now, when we get into relative energy deficiency in sport, as it says here, it is a very complex syndrome, and we'll show you a really lovely infographic to do with that. But it is generally underpinned or caused by low energy availability. And that, again, is a very important point to take away from this. And RED-S, formerly known as the female triad, but then what has been recognized is there is much more to the condition than just low energy availability, bone health, and menstrual dysfunction, because ultimately male and female athletes can be affected by this. Elizabeth, did you want to say anything about that, or we'll go to the next screen and you can talk?
Yeah, I think the next one.
Do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. So this, I think this chart is helpful. We do receive a lot of questions on how do I know if I'm consuming enough, how much to consume. I think female athletes especially will often get a number in their head that they think they're supposed to weigh, and it doesn't matter regardless, like that's the number, the magic number. And so they will do what they can to get to that. I think race weight becomes a big component. So this chart can help give you, when you're looking, like when you get a DEXA scan, which we recommend everybody get, not just for looking at body fat percentage and fat mass, but also for looking at bone density, effect that you will see a negative impact if you have low energy availability for a long time. So this points out the body fat percentage and kind of where you can get into trouble. And if you're looking at, as Scott said, that bottom row down there has the 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, which if you have, it clearly shows at 121 pounds, that bare minimum is 1435 for calories. And how that can change even with a heavier athlete, depending on their fat-free mass above. Scott, is there numerically, do you want to talk?
Yeah, I think the biggest point here is you can see that actually you can go into quite a low caloric amount. And now this is based on 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. And we're not saying these are the magic numbers, but it's just a good indication that you can see here an 121-pound athlete or 55-kilo athlete may, based on their fat-free mass, may actually require potentially, in order to push them into LEA, could actually be higher than someone who is actually a heavier athlete because they've got far more body fat to lose and therefore don't have as much fat-free mass. So it is theoretical calculations, but what we wanted to highlight is that, you know, there can be a case of using lower calories in order to achieve a caloric deficit without necessarily being pushed into a low energy availability. So again, these would be pretty drastic numbers to be hitting for someone, but it is a good reminder that that you can use calories and be in a caloric deficit in order to achieve improvements in body composition, but not necessarily go super low. So that's all we wanted to say with that. It's not always a case of, you know, avoid being in a caloric deficit, because ultimately physics is going to dictate if you want to lose weight or if you want to lose body fat, you are going to have to be in a caloric deficit It's just that you don't necessarily have to go into low energy availability in order to achieve that. So drastic cuts don't always have to occur, but you can certainly cut caloric intake if you require to improve body composition because you're carrying excess body fat. And I think the big take home here as well is that look at the low athlete in terms of the 120-pound athlete who, if a female athlete was sitting at 13%, you sure as hell don't need to be cutting calories. I'll tell you that now, okay? Like it just is not necessarily going to improve performance. And it's certainly, if you start dropping percentage of body weight from there, you're probably going to have a severe impact on a lot of these. So this is what ultimately being in low energy availability and suffering from relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S. It has multifactorial impact. So previously, the female triad was just menstrual dysfunction, bone health as a result of low energy availability. It is now recognized, and as I said, those two papers that we referenced at the start, it is a huge impact on the body for anyone who goes through this. And again, Elizabeth and Danny will attest to this, but we just want to give you an overview that it is not just your bones or your menstrual dysfunction that is going to be affected. There are wide-ranging impacts of this condition if it does affect you. So, and again, talked about this, heard a lot about it, but these are the most common types of signs or symptoms of underfueling. Frequent bone injuries. Danny will talk about her stress reactions and stress fractures. Prolonged low mood. You know, if everyone gets grumpy, I get grumpy, but if you're constantly just hating training because you're in low energy availability, that's probably a good sign. Low energy, not being able to do your sessions, not being able to get out of bed, not being able to work on a daily basis, probably a good sign. Increasing poor sleep quality. Add to that night sweats. Talking to a female athlete in Kona, and she didn't have any stress injuries yet, but she hated training. She had no energy for training. She wasn't sleeping properly, and she had night sweats, but her doctor wasn't listening to her because didn't understand what she was doing in terms of her training load. The low mood and the prolonged irritability sort of play hand in hand. Erratic and decreased performance. If your sessions initially, because you're dropping weight, are going really well, but then you start to notice that wattage is dropping, speed's dropping, you're erratic in terms of your performance, it's probably a good sign you're underfueling. Obviously, from a blood perspective, if you're iron deficient, anemic, then that's probably another potential telltale sign that something's going on. T3 is another marker that you may want to consider getting. And then if you're also getting frequently sick, it's another really good indication that you're probably underfueling. Elizabeth, I'll let you run into these ones. You can talk about RED-S, I'll talk about the OTS.
Sure. So as Scott we've been kind of attesting to, these are all connected. And I think what I want to particularly stress is that what can start innocently or even naively enough can turn into a multitude of different conditions. And it's not just I will underfuel potentially in this one session and then in these next sessions. And then eventually low energy availability can turn into RED-S, can turn into overtraining syndrome. And we've now sabotaged the season, the performance, the original intent of what started as I'm just going to eat a little less. So chronic low energy availability has been shown to result in RED-S. I can attest to that. What's complicated though is that there's no particular diagnosis. And if you're not seeing a physician or an endocrinologist or even an OBGYN that isn't familiar with some of these, a diagnosis could be missed. I know that, it happened with me. It's kind of, if you're not looking and they don't have the tool to understand, because low iron, we're told that female athletes, especially runners, have that all the time. So I might not attribute that to RED-S, or, oh, my mood has changed. Well, it could just be part of my cycle. And, you know, so there's all these different symptoms that, unless we see them all together in a full picture, can be missed and therefore have bigger problems down the road.
Yeah. And I think the other thing here is, obviously we're talking about chronic low energy availability and going back to that very low amount of intake. Now, again, there is emerging evidence to support that low carbohydrate availability in the acute setting can have negative impact on bone markers. We do acknowledge that. But I think what's also really important for athletes to understand is doing some lower calorie training or throughout the day and throughout the week in order to achieve a caloric deficit, in order to lose body fat, still has its place. So there is that distinction and understanding and recognizing when things like low energy availability in the chronic setting, heading into RED-S occurs, versus purposely being in a caloric deficit for a purpose and still eating good quality food, adequate amounts of protein, optimal timing with nutrition that can have a positive impact on health and ultimately performance as well. So I think that is really important for people to understand, because I think it is very confusing for a lot of athletes to say, oh, I don't want to be in low energy availability, I want to avoid RED-S, but how the hell do I lose some body fat? If body fat is something that needs to be addressed because potentially it is unhealthy. So I think it is very confusing for a lot of athletes, and it is important to understand that distinction. In terms of overtraining syndrome, I think what's really interesting about overtraining syndrome is, does overtraining syndrome exist? Is overtraining syndrome just an extension of ultimately low energy availability, RED-S, and your inability to actually meet the demands of what the training load is? And I think it's more towards that. I think that OTS was an acronym given when athletes couldn't meet the training demands. And actually now when we look at it and the research, and unfortunately, a lot of the research actually avoided asking the question about energy intake when they were diagnosing overtraining syndrome. So they were looking at sort of the output of overtraining syndrome rather than looking at the input of what's causing overtraining syndrome. And I think what is, again, being recognized very well with these athletes that were doing a lot of training with chronic low energy availability, that ends up resulting in this syndrome of overtraining. And again, very similar to RED-S, and this is why there's crossover, is that there is no singular validated diagnosis method, okay, for RED-S or overtraining syndrome. So it is a very complex set of diagnoses that needs to be recognized by professionals. And so this is why when you start to think you may be suffering from this, is certainly reach out to professionals, whether that's a nutrition expert, whether it is a sports doctor who has a good understanding of this, or, as Elizabeth said, people like endocrinologists who take a special interest in these types of conditions. So, as I said, you know, this is from the Stellingworth paper, but I think on the left, the big crux is, you know, energy intake is less than energy expenditure relative to fat-free mass. Now, as it says here, the underlying etiology of RED-S is low energy availability, chronic, okay? Short-term low energy availability or reduction in calories can be effective for certain individuals and for people that require that. What we're talking about here is very, very low amounts of energy relative to the training that ultimately could have impact on the rest of these conditions, and these conditions can also have an impact on that low as a result of that low energy availability. So ruling out low energy availability as a potential cause is probably the first step for when any of those signs and symptoms of RED-S exist, and then ruling out any of these types of conditions as well. So potentially for the clinician or the athlete trying to understand why things occur, first take a look at energy intake. I think it's always amazing to me when athletes suffer stress fractures, and in their posts on social media, it's like, we're exploring all avenues. We don't know where it is. We don't know where it's come from. And it's like, seriously, like, have a look at your body type at the moment and look at why this has occurred, because it is, I would say 90, unless you've got a fused ankle and you've got some serious biomechanical issues, low energy availability is why that stress fracture is going to be occurring in probably 95% of athletes. So I think it's like a little bit of ownership of this needs to start occurring in the general public and with athletes in particular. I think rather than sort of sugarcoating it and going, we're searching for the answers, just say, hey, I probably wasn't eating enough and I need to address that. That's my personal opinion. I'm probably pretty vocal about that, but I think it's sort of, it's the reality of the situation these days. Like, let's just own it and then address it. Obviously, there is a lot of psychological components to this, but that is the reason most often that certainly bone injuries are going to be occurring. That's my rant. Elizabeth, you want to talk about this specifically?
I did. So Paula has spoken I think it's always important to get kind of the professional side as well as the everyday athlete side. And Paula has spoken recently and quite regularly the last 2 years about how changes in her diet really had an impact on injury, on performance, and how she didn't realize that she wasn't eating enough until she was spending time with some other triathletes, with her partner, seeing how much he was eating. She, has now worked her way up. She, in a recent podcast she gave, she was speaking about how before races, she would have maybe half of a bagel with some peanut butter, and then maybe one gel on the bike and just water on the run, which is just, chronically low, appalling, but also she has worked up now to having 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour on her bike and her run, and what a difference that's made. And so pointing out that people, even with, a team around them, even with having been in sport for a long time, either intentionally or unintentionally, as Scott pointed out earlier, there's performance being left on the table. We're not fueling properly. And in session, in training specifically, what a difference that can make in your racing, in terms of consuming the calories that your body needs to consume for the work that you're doing. So
yeah. No, I think it's a really good point. And Paula doesn't actually work with Fuelin. We just wanted to highlight this as an athlete, but Holly Lawrence does work with us, and Holly's been pretty open about her, when she had some issues. She previously posted about this on Instagram a few years ago, but more recently, without going again into too much detail with Holly, is she made the comment to me that since working together, she potentially was always underfueling and has been a chronic underfueler her entire career, which I thought was a fascinating take. And she's very professional and very engaged in what she does, and a very smart athlete. But her takeaway currently has been that maybe she was always underfueling. And so I think it is, if you are, you don't have to be a professional triathlete and performing at their level to be underfueling, but it is certainly something to think about. So I thought we'd get into, does anyone have any questions at this point in time? I know we've sort of gone through a lot of the signs and symptoms, the etiology, that sort of stuff, and we're talking a lot of acronyms, but does anyone have any questions at this point in time that they did want to ask about sort of what we've discussed so far? I'll give you, if you want to, feel free to put your questions into the chat if that is preferred. You don't want to ask them out. Some people do get a bit shy. I appreciate that. So if you do want to just put it in the chat, we can go through that as well. And Jonathan can moderate that.
Or just raise your hand and jump in.
Or just jump in, yeah. But a lot of people don't like doing that until someone does it, and then everyone starts. So let's start talking about this. So, I mean, I'll start with Elizabeth. When do you want to just give a little bit of background about when it started and what sort of triggered it for you?
Sure. So the very short version, I've written about this on our Fuelin page in different articles, spoken about it with Sarah on her podcast. So if you want full details, you can go there. But the short version is I think it started, I know it started just like everybody, a lot of the other people that will talk about this, the design, like looking at professional athletes and thinking that leaner is better or leaner is faster. And having enough knowledge about nutrition to know, you know, doesn't necessarily keep you, make you immune to disordered eating and underfueling and eventually RED-S. So seeing very lean triathletes and wanting to get faster and being competitive, that's another quality, that type A competition, wanting to be fast and be on the podium. And then the kind of influence of social media and the comments from people and the pressure to perform and the pressure to always look a certain way kind of was the magic unhealthy potion that led to, okay, if I train all the time and don't eat on my longer training runs, if I eat a little bit less, you kind of adapt and learn to be hungry and kind of put things aside. And then once that ball starts rolling, having a lack of calories, they've shown you're not thinking as clearly as you were before. And so your decision making is off, and it leads to that very unhealthy kind of sick place. And you can convince yourself that what you're doing is for performance when it really isn't.
And when did it actually start though, Elizabeth? Like how old were you?
After college. So I was I think, competitive athlete, swimmer and water polo player in college. And then
how old were you?
22, 23.
Okay. And did you, in your teenage years, did you ever have any issues with eating? And
nope.
So
I was the swimmer that, like, we were, thick, big, bulky swimmers. We ate a lot. It was never like diet culture was never a part of my life.
Which is quite interesting because a lot of eating disorders will tend to start in early teenage years, and a lot of females in particular will get out of that eating disorder or disordered eating before they hit 20. So in your case, it was a little bit later. And did you have a particular trigger? You're saying the trigger was moving from swimming into triathlon because of seeing runners? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think it was the hyper focus on runners' bodies and just the difference between the swimming mentality and kind of that triathlete runner mentality. And then definitely social media played a really big part.
Okay.
And yeah, in having to constantly keep up a level of appearance and performance and getting addicted to likes on Instagram or comments or, what I realize now and is silly.
Okay. And Danny, for you, when did it sort of start? And do you know, just so everyone knows, Danny's a professional triathlete that we've worked together for the past year, and as has been documented in some of the social media over the past week or so, has unfortunately suffered from RED-S and still has some ongoing issues with bone issues and other dysfunction, which we'll get into. But Danny, do you want just give a little bit of an intro of when it sort of you noticed issues occurring in your life, or when it started?
Yeah, sure. So my story is a little bit different than Elizabeth's. I wasn't a competitive, I definitely participated in sports in high school. And then in college, I started, did some intramurals, but then I started kind of running for fun because I wasn't playing sports anymore and needed to do something. My issues didn't stem from this like sports background at all, actually. I think I started struggling with food in college, maybe late high school, but in college, and it was mostly due to, I think, a variety of factors, right? Like I moved away from home. I went through this awful breakup with my boyfriend. I was like miserable trying to just adapt. And food was like one thing that, I mean, it was definitely the societal pressure of like, oh, you shouldn't gain the freshman 15. And there was like those ideas kind of around, but it was never really about that, so to speak, for me. It was just like, that was something that I could focus on. And it was like, okay, like, I don't know what else is going on in my life. Like, I haven't figured out this college thing yet, but I know like I can do this and I can do this pretty well. Like I can control like what I'm eating and this, and it just was like, it eased a little bit of everything else for me. So it didn't, so then I started to compete actually like kind of post developing issues, and whether or not like it was related, that, I mean, you know, it's kind of entangled, like the, you know, my reasons for exercising, but eventually I figured out like I just loved running. And then I eventually found out I love swimming and biking. And that's actually been more of a catalyst for change for me, because I realized really quick that you can't get away with not fueling well if you want to be doing these things. And I immediately was running into issues with getting hurt, particularly bone injuries, and learned that that was related to, you know, this underfueling that I've been doing. So sport's been super helpful for me. I think it's
do you think, Danny, like, sorry to interrupt, but has the sport been helpful, or has it been a hindrance in terms of, has it been, you got into sport to get you healthy, but did the pressures of the sport then start to, at what point did it start to drive like, oh, I if I don't eat, or if I lose more weight, it's going to improve performance? Like, do you remember when that occurred for you, when you weren't fueling? Like, did you purposely reduce fuel or eating? Can you remember when that happened?
So I think because of my history, that was always my tendency. So when I came into the sport, I was already having those tendencies. And when I started to, particularly, I kind of shifted from running to triathlon, and all of a sudden my like activity increased quite a bit, because I went from, you know, one sport to three. And to be honest, like I didn't have like the thought didn't even enter my mind that like I needed to fuel more. And there was never the thought like, oh, I need to be, you know, at this weight for performance. Like that really was never the catalyst. It was always just this running tape in my head, like, oh, I don't need that much. I don't need that much. That's too much. Like I don't know, like I need to stay in this body, but it was never for performance. It wasn't until I realized that if I wanted to perform better, I needed to actually fuel more.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Elizabeth, what was the first thing that happened to you that you started to notice, or when did you get your first sort of injury or stress fracture? Or
so I had all of the symptoms, and then the stress fracture was like the final, I guess, blow, which that's my foot in a boot there. I think that was the second time. So I had the horrible night sweats to the point where I had to change my sheets every night and like sleep on a towel. My hair started to fall out. I didn't have my cycle for years and years. And it was convenient at first. It was like, oh, I'm, you know, not trying to have kids just yet. It's a lot easier to not have to worry about this. It'll come back. It's not really, you know, and when you're not seeing the effects that it's affecting bone density and potentially increasing breast cancer risk and, you know, all the other things going along with not having your cycle that are going on internally, it's easy to kind of look the other way. I gut issues, like because I wasn't eating enough, all food kind of started to, I couldn't digest food very well anymore. And so all of those other things, I think the hyper focus on food kind of took over. I'm a very social person. I would avoid social situations. I was tired all the time. So all of those other things that we see which I just kind of ignored, like, oh, I'm training all the time. And I would train more then to fill that time. And then eventually the stress fractures, which ironically then I couldn't train at all or do any of the things that I loved. And then I was really miserable.
Did you during that time, did you ever talk to anyone about the signs and symptoms that you had, and was it ignored?
It was, my family was concerned, and most, obviously not from a medical perspective, but they could see that I had lost a lot of weight and that food had kind of become an obsession. I had certain things I ate and at certain times, and everything had to be a particular way. And then, friends outside and in triathlon were like, wow, you're, so lean. So I had, and I obviously, I don't think they were doing that intentionally. It was like, they saw the picture that they thought was right as well. It was a coach that actually brought it up, Matt Dixon with Purple Patch, that, pulled me out of a workout very concerned and was saying, what's going on? Do you want to talk about it? And that was the first opportunity that was someone that I trusted. Not that I don't trust my family, but it was someone that I knew in terms of sport and in life cared about me enough to want to say something. And it really helped give me the opportunity to kind of open up and notice what I had been willfully ignoring.
Yeah. I mean, very, very good of Matt to actually step out of that coaching role as well and recognize it, because I think it is something that can be done by people who understand the conditions, and certainly not just accept that an athlete, if you are displaying those signs and symptoms, to actually reach out and help. So I think credit to Matt for doing that.
Yeah.
So it's really good. I did have a question for you. I'll jump to Danny. Danny, in terms of your first injuries or signs or symptoms, what did you first recognize? And when did that occur? In your 20s?
Yeah, I think as it relates to sport, is definitely stress fracture. Was like the first, a huge sign that wow, I'm really,
where was the stress
something's really
fracture?
not going on. It was in my heel. And it was in 2011, I think, was the first one. I was training for my first full marathon, and I had that date circled on my calendar. I was so stoked. And it happened I think 3 weeks before the marathon. And I was so devastated. I really thought my life was over at some point. I was I had a really hard time coping with that. So that's when I started, that was the first one. I got through that. I got another one a year later. I got and then after the third or fourth one, I was okay. It was easier for the first couple to say oh, it happened once, it's going to be fine now, or something like that. But which is not even the case, right? But it was easier for me to brush it under the rug. But once I started getting them more frequently, I really was okay, this is something that's really plaguing me for sure.
But what I struggle with this is was anyone talking to you that was treating you or helping you? Were they bringing up that, look, you're very lean, you're very small. I know not always you think that, but from my perspective, you are. And when they were dealing with your stress fractures, was anyone mentioning to you about low energy availability, or how much are you eating? Was anyone addressing nutrition at that point in time in your 20s?
Yeah, they did. The very first doctor had brought that up, and he was I was open that I had a history of struggling with food in my, earlier, and even at that time, I definitely was. So, and yeah, it was definitely brought up. But like I said, it took me a couple of times to really really be like, are you sure? Like, it can just happen, right? Like, I don't know. I didn't know anything about stress fractures until, like, I've definitely gone through now and educated myself. But yeah, I think it was more, I wasn't ready to hear it.
Okay, so it was more that they were telling you about it, but you weren't taking it in and continuing with your eating behaviors and training behaviors.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I know we have discussed this on Q&As, and also you've been pretty vocal about it, but when did you first lose your period? When did you notice that you were getting menstrual dysfunction?
Yeah, so I was put on birth control in high school at like age, I don't know, 17 or something, because I had bad cramps, which was like, I don't even remember them being that bad, but they're like, oh, go on birth control, easy fix, right? So anyways, I was on that through my early 20s. I think, and I can't remember my exact age when I came off of it, but maybe like, yeah, early 20s, 23 or 24. As soon as I came off of it though, I did not get a cycle at all. So that's been, I don't want to age myself too much, but it's been a very long time. And it never came back. And I went to women's health provider, followed up with endocrinology, like all of these things now, like trying to get my bone health in order in particular, but also trying to, like just be a healthier person. But yeah.
And so you, just so without aging you, as you said, but 10 years, is that correct?
Yeah, a little over 10 years. And then in January of this year, I got it back. Like, it came back.
Yeah, which is great. And I think and the really interesting about that, Danny, and I know it's not as regular as we would like. And I think, again, you've acknowledged that there are some ongoing issues, and unfortunately you have another stress fracture. And I think, what is really interesting in reading the research is that a lot of this has to be addressed before your third decade of life to really try and maximize improvements in bone health, improvements in fertility for a female. And, Danny obviously expressed to me that having a family was really important to her. And so that was one of the key elements to assist her in trying to really focus on eating for health, as opposed to anything other than that. Like, performance was very secondary, I guess, in the end. And it comes back to that why do you want to actually get healthy? And I think for Danny, it was about trying to have a family, which was great. It's the point being there, sorry, Danny, is that it still is not right, would you say, like in terms of that, and bone health is still problematic with you. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so you're right. Like, what I've been told, that like once you hit 30, like it's really hard to increase bone density, which was problematic because it was like, that was about the time that I was figuring out that it was really low. I have been able to increase it though. It's increased quite a bit. And my endocrinologist is like, I don't know what you're doing, but like, keep it up. So it's just a testament to like how improving nutrition really can help. Now it's more of like, okay, like they still say like, just don't let it drop. Like, let's keep you stable. I still have low bone density, but not to the extent that I did.
What's your T-score now? It's minus.
I think
minus
it's
1. Is it
1.1 or something? Yeah, and I was almost in the osteoporosis category, like when I had my first DEXA scan. So
I think
that's really come up.
I think you were minus 2.4. I saw on your history. So minus 2.5 on a T-score is effectively osteoporosis. And again, a lot of the literature, I guess, it does say that once you develop osteoporosis, you probably won't get back the trabecular structure of the bone. But I think there is emerging evidence as well that bone density can be improved, but it may never resolve back to normal, right. Which, again, I think for everyone listening is that if these are signs and symptoms of things and you've had a DEXA scan and someone is addressing this and you're looking at all these things, like, if you're in your 20s, you need to address it before you get into your 30s to try and give yourself the most opportunity to actually fix your health. You know, and it is a race against time in that sense, I guess. And what about you, Elizabeth, in terms of menstrual dysfunction in your 20s as well?
Yeah. So it was close to a little over 8 years. And being injured, and not doing anything and eating, my period came back, I think the second month of my injury, and it has been regular ever since. And it's funny how much I used to hate and dread it, and every month it's this badge of honor still years later of yep, okay, you're still doing something right. And adjusting training, adding strength training to improve bone density, all of those, really looking at my blood markers, making sure that calcium and vitamin D and iron and all of those things, it's a very holistic solution. It's not just one thing. It wasn't just, oh, I'll eat more when I'm training, or, oh, I'll make sure my post-workout meal is enough. It is consistent every day, looking at all of the different components and really prioritizing health. It's funny, performance kind of went out the window. It became about health. So did body image and all that other kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not immune to wanting to look a certain way, but gaining weight, I gained a significant 15-ish pounds. I don't own a scale, so I'm not sure at this point. And being okay with that, and your body changing, and prioritizing health.
Yeah, I actually, that was the question I was going to ask, is something and it sort of came up. It was the Alter G. Alter Gs are great for, injuries and that and whatnot. But one thing I did notice with your comment there, you learned to love that machine because it allowed you to get back to it. But I was that's really negative, because it was you were reinforcing the fact that you could get back to it without eating and still be injured. And I don't know, do you think about that now? And I know people use, and Danny, you use the lever and things like that. And I do wonder sometimes whether these devices nearly reinforce that, oh, I can still get back to it even though I'm not quite right.
Absolutely. It allowed, that was, I think, the final, that picture was from the final, but I had done the Alter G before. It was one of the, I call them tricks I used to convince myself that I was getting better, and that, oh, okay, it's not that bad. I'll get injured and then I'll use the Alter G and I'll be careful for a little while, and then not address the problem. And then the stress fractures would come back. But also it did finally, once I did adjust, it genuinely helped with my sanity. I think
sure.
Endurance person on here won't that was my, hour to get to feel like I used to feel. And it ended up becoming my motivation to you want to do this outside. You don't want to be, I'd be sitting there in the chiropractor sports PT office. People were coming in for their appointments, and I'm just, running in the middle of the office. And it's I want to be outside. I want to be racing. So it hindered and then helped.
Yeah. I guess it's that distinction, isn't it? From a mindset of, doing something again for health purposes without accelerating the damage that's been done. So, and then just actually on your point, bone mineral density now for you?
0.2.
Okay. And what was it at its lowest?
Negative 1.7.
Okay. So yeah. So anything less than -1, just for people who may get a DEXA scan in terms of bone mineral density, then that would hint towards osteopenia, and then -2.5 as a T-score would be looking at osteoporosis. So again, very big believers in, and just anecdotally, just so everyone knows, I was involved in a group where we were looking at preventive medicine here in Australia, and I think we had 55 people come through the program. Average age was probably around 40. Screening for bone mineral density in Australia under government does not occur until 75 years of age, I believe, 70 or 75. Over 50% of the individuals who came through had low bone mineral density. And not all of them were athletes, and certainly not all of them were under fueling, because a lot of them had probably were either obese or overweight. So I think what it comes down to is inactivity and lack of loading on bones can also significantly impact bone health. And two things that won't impact bone health in a positive direction is swimming and cycling, just so you understand that as triathletes. Running will have a positive impact, and so will plyometric activity, and so will weight training. And that is a really important point to just note, because I know a lot of training does involve a lot of time on the bike. Maybe not so much time in the pool, but certainly on the bike. And so if you don't know what your bone mineral density is, I would certainly suggest go and get a DEXA scan.
And Scott, you and I have talked about the importance of strength training. We've seen a lot in triathlete strength training and heavy lifting strength training. And if you really do want to improve bone density, it requires actual lifting heavy weights. It's not the 25 reps of squats, 5 sets real quick. It's adding in that heavy weight. And I work with a strength coach because as a triathlete, even as a swimmer in college, we had strength and conditioning coaches, but learning the proper form, the proper amount, how to load, that really does have an impact, and it has an impact on all other kinds of injuries and then performance. So it's a win-win on all fronts.
Yeah, definitely. Danny, do you want to add, is there anything in particular that you just want to add, just in terms of your experience and, from what you have gone through to what you are going through? Do you want to add anything else in, just as a real key takeaway for athletes, and maybe they can reach out to you as well if people, I know you're on Instagram and things like that, but just, is there anything that you'd really want to get across to, not just young female athletes, but just young athletes, I think in particular, who maybe may hear a lot of similarities in what your story was, and also Elizabeth's?
Yeah. Nothing in particular, but I think something that I'm definitely open to talking to anyone if they want to reach out. That's one thing that's been really helpful for me. And I've been able to talk to Elizabeth a little bit. And I was like, I don't think I've actually talked to someone who's been through it and came out the other side. And, it just is really helpful to know that, a lot of people have, society in general is going to cause a lot of, these really negative messages. And then a lot of people are going through trying to sort this out in their own mind, what is right, what is wrong. So happy to talk about that. I think it's just it's super helpful to connect with other people. One thing I like about Fuelin is then it's pretty clear with the program what your needs are. So it's not a guessing game. It's one of the big benefits that that I get out of it, because you can easily convince yourself oh, I don't need that, or I don't know, whatever, it's helpful for me.
There's still some of that battle though, isn't there? There is always that occasional question, do I really need this much? And it's yes, you do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go away overnight, I guess.
Yeah. So no, happy to reach out. I think the other thing I would say too, and I think I said this, I was fortunate enough to be on the If We Were Riding podcast we recorded last night, and they asked if I had a piece of advice or something, and one of it was to talk to others. My other piece of advice was to just try feeling more if you think that might be an issue. This was, I don't remember who told me this or when it happened, but it's been several years ago. But they told me, they were just try it. Like, try eating a little bit more. And honestly, it's like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Like, if you don't like it, you can always go back to where you were. But I guarantee, like, if you are suffering from any of these symptoms, like, once you do start eating more, like, how much better it feels, you probably aren't going to want to go back. But it just makes it a little safer to kind of like to test it out. And there's nothing irreversible that you can't, that can't be undone. So, but there's definitely opportunity to improve a lot of things. So it's worth it.
Thanks, Danny. Okay. Sorry. There's some, okay. So we had some, we're probably just on time. And I am aware we were only going to go for an hour, but we'll probably just go a little bit over as per usual. As long as everyone's okay with that, we'll just keep going. If people want to drop off, we can certainly do that. But we had some questions come through for some users, some athletes. And just before we get into this, I just want to thank Elizabeth and Danny for just being open and vulnerable for what you've just shared. And I know it's not easy for either of you to do that, and certainly not do it publicly. So I'd just like to say thank you for that.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for the opportunity. It's getting to share and talk about it with people is important. And I think if, Feisty's done a great job of spreading the message and making it acceptable to discuss and bring up and kind of bring awareness to the fact that a lot of athletes, either intentionally or unintentionally, aren't giving their body what they need for sport and for life.
Yeah. So I think these two questions are really poignant to what I was trying to get across at the start, is that there are athletes out there that are trying to lose weight, but also want to fuel their performance. And again, come back to be objective about this, like get a DEXA scan, find out how overweight are you if that is a concern, because what we also see is the reverse of this is we see some very light athletes and very lean athletes still saying they want to lose weight. And it's like, there is this sort of distinction in either mindset, but also the physical characteristics of athletes. So I think the big point here is if you do have body composition concerns, i.e. you have a fat mass index that is out of the range of what is normal. And again, within the Fuelin program, we help athletes understand a DEXA report so that you can look from a health perspective and potentially a performance perspective, but first and foremost, a health perspective, whether you do sit outside the ranges that would be considered healthy, and could losing body fat or fat mass have a positive impact on your health first and foremost. Now, obviously, if you go the extremes of what Danny and Elizabeth have talked about, that becomes unhealthy. But I think as a society and as a practitioner, I think we would be naive to say that it is okay to be severely overweight or obese, because that is not healthy either. And it's not saying that you can't be happy in that state or comfortable in that state, but let's not confuse being overweight or obese as being healthy, because it is not a healthy state. And the CDC just released a stat yesterday, it was this week or something, that 55% of America will be over a BMI of 30 by 2030. Now that, I don't know where Australia sits on that, but that is not a good statistic to have. And we know that being overweight and obese is going to cause chronic health conditions. So I think that it's really important for people to understand that as well. Like, there is the distinction between being happy and how you sit, but also understanding that being overweight or obese is going to have negative health implications. So I think these two questions are very timely, in that you can still be in a caloric deficit, but you don't have to hit those super low numbers that we put out at the start as well. So that caloric deficit should be controlled. It still means hitting high amounts of protein. So if you want to lose weight and you're performing exercise, yes, you need to eat. You need to eat a lot of protein. And I cannot stress that enough, that high protein intake will certainly assist your weight loss journey, and it will support repair and maintenance of lean muscle, help with bone structure, and so on. Fat is very important, but just keeping fat in a moderate amount. You don't have to be, well, certainly if you're on a high fat, low carb diet, then that's probably for you to decide. We certainly don't advocate that in our program, but controlling fat and consuming fats and good quality fats like monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated omega-6 fats is going to be a very important part of the program in helping you understand your weight loss journey, if that is something important to you, but not over consuming fat in that sense. And then the timing of carbohydrates and the types of carbohydrates that you consume are going to become very important. So certainly not avoiding carbs. You want to be eating carbohydrates, and certainly post-session is very important to be consuming carbohydrates to help with some of these bone mineral markers, also to help with hormonal control, and also help with energy availability. So carbohydrates come in the form of vegetables and salad. They're obviously going to be lower amounts of carbohydrates, but still super important. And then depending on the intensity and duration, you will be then stacking or layering on top things like root vegetables, grains, seeds, and higher glycemic type foods, and also including fruit into that. But ultimately, it comes down to being in a minor or a small deficit relative to the energy expenditure. And that is how you'll do it over time. And I think the other thing, just while I'm talking about this before Elizabeth jumps in, is that don't expect all your weight or your fat to come off overnight. And often what I'll say, and maybe it's the wrong way of saying it, but you probably didn't put the weight on overnight. So don't expect for it to come off overnight as well. Have patience in that journey. Enjoy the pain of the exercise and eating better, like embrace it all. I think it's Jock, what's his name? Jock Wilco. He's like an SAS guy, and he says like, good, just say good to everything. Does it hurt? Good. Is it hard? Good. Like, I love that mindset. And if you want to hear more about that, it's a Tim Ferriss podcast where he interviews this Jock Wilco. He's a fascinating character, but like, embrace the pain of it all. You know, it's hard. It is hard work. And so I think it is important just to recognize where you are at a point in time, recognize the past, and then recognize the future of where that's going to take you. Do you have anything to add to that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think the tie-in here, obviously these were questions that were submitted to us, but specifically with what we've been talking about with Feisty and leading back to low energy availability, is the constant messages that we receive of losing weight, increasing performance, finding that balance, knowing where you're at, which is why we talk about the DEXA and getting your blood labs done, like having that healthy assessment and those points as opposed to just a random number you pick on the scale is very important. And understanding why and where the potential need for weight loss is coming from. Is it coming because your DEXA came back with a higher than healthy body fat percentage, or your numbers were low? Or is it because you're looking on social media and you see that you should look a certain way? So understanding all the components that go into this, and then differentiating between and knowing when low energy availability is appropriate and when it isn't, and then when it isn't, when it becomes a problem. And the longer it goes, not only is the more damage that it's doing, the harder that it is to get out of it. So anyone that's on, or anyone that knows someone that you might be, think, oh, they do 4 or 5 hour rides and don't fuel, they skip breakfast, they do this. The sooner that they can get help and address these issues, the better.
Absolutely agree. I think this is really a really interesting question, because I think going back to what we see in social media and what you see, on television, you do see a lot of athletes, especially in this sport and historically in this sport, in certain Ironman and triathlon is that some of the people up the front are very, very lean and low. And I guess this comes back to my point of when stuff does go wrong for those athletes, it's sort of owning the space and not sort of going around it and saying, we're not really sure why I had this. Actually, Alistair Brownlee actually did a post recently about this because he recognized he was under fueling and he unfortunately suffered a femoral stress fracture. But he addressed this. He said he got it wrong.
Yeah.
And he was under fueling. And I thought that was really great to hear a champion athlete to say, you know what, I got it wrong and it was all because of food.
Yeah.
So
Jesse Thomas has talked about it quite openly about how he had disordered eating from his running days. And then kind of how that carried over in different injuries that he's had. And I think with professional triathletes, I think we see sometimes too what we want to see, but also I think there's a particular body type of athlete that either does well or is drawn to the sport, and that's kind of their body type naturally. So a lot of people trying to achieve, we're all different. Like we all have different body composition and body structure. And so to look and judge someone just based on their appearance doesn't tell you all that you need to know. And so it's two-factor. We can't just look at the professionals and, you know, say that that's the only kind of performance, because there is a wide range of triathletes, runners, swimmers that in all these endurance sports that do have a different body type and are healthy and have had long, you know, careers, really successful careers in triathlon. So kind of picking out, oh, those are the ones that, you know, the ones that win, but there are plenty of healthy body images that are on podiums or doing well. And then the ones that aren't, if you look at it, you know, we've had a lot of the top athletes, I'm not going to name people, that have had injuries, bone injuries specifically. And it's like, you see, okay, they might be winning, but for how long or at what cost and what other components come into play.
Yeah. And I think on this last point as well is that anyone who's heard the Norwegian athletes or the Norwegian coaching staff talk about their approach to nutrition, it is like they're all about eating. And I think it's so refreshing to hear that, like, literally that's all they focus on. They focus on eating and eating a hell of a lot. And I think results speak for themselves. So what is really cool is seeing the flip of this and saying, let's talk about food and let's talk about eating a hell of a lot of food. And that's all we do. We just eat because that's how their training is based. It's based on caloric expenditure. If they don't eat enough, they don't do that training. And I think that's a really cool flip on the whole narrative. So can you keep training at a high volume intensity whilst recovering from RED-S? If not, what modifications? No, you can't. You can't. Simple as that. You should not and you should not and cannot continue at a high volume intensity when recovering from these conditions. There are some pretty interesting case studies, again, looking at this, but the overriding thing is increasing body mass, increasing body fat, increasing nutritional intake, addressing micronutritional deficiencies in calcium, in vitamin D, cognitive behavioral therapy in order to rewire why the low energy availability may be occurring, but it needs to be all addressed to get the bone mineral density back up to where it potentially was pre disordered eating or eating disorder occurred and low energy availability, and menstrual cycle returning ideally in a very consistent manner so that it is very regular. But yeah, the overriding message there is, no, you need to adjust you and your coach and whoever your team is supporting you need to adjust your volume and intensity.
Yeah. And I think I want to particularly point out what I see in this question is troublesome in that and I don't know who asked this question, but once it's like, if someone told you, you have diabetes and you're saying, well, can I fix it, but can I still keep eating the sugar? And it's like, no, you really can't. So I worry that this person that asked this question doesn't really want to address the issues that caused the LEA and RED-S. And it's like, either your priority is getting healthy, or it's finding a way, and I know this because I did it, finding a way to keep doing what you're doing and still get better. And so the clinical answer is no, but the psychological answer, for lack of a better word, is also no. Like, you have to address what's going on underneath, what the question behind the question, I think, is if your priority really is getting healthy, that volume and intensity of training is so far off the page and the picture. It should be, because that's only going to keep putting you back further and not actually solving the problem.
Yeah, I think it's a very good observation. It's avoiding, isn't it? So
yeah.
Can I please do
Yeah.
it?
I did it, and that's how I know.
Yeah. Look, I think the take-home message for relative energy deficiency syndrome is it is a very real consideration. Okay. For all athletes, male, female, when you're presenting with those signs and symptoms, and even before presenting with those signs and symptoms and recognizing when you're doing it. As Danny and Elizabeth highlighted, it's not always clear cut, and it's not always treated or acted upon when individual signs or symptoms start to present. And it is more often the athlete recognizing that, but hopefully their support crew, closest family, people like that also recognize it and seeking help. And low energy availability is more often than not the prime driver for all of these issues. Okay. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, as highlighted. It is a complicated topic. Please don't think it's not. And even the work that we do in terms of a simple color coding system for traffic lights, there is a lot behind it in terms of decision making to why you would be getting that amount of energy supplied to you based on intensity, duration, training load, volume, things like that, and your personal requirements. So just remember that fueling is complicated, and it's still an ongoing work of research, I think, in terms of how it's applied in a clinical setting. So, emerging evidence all the time in research, which is becoming, I think what's lovely about the nutritional space is there is a much bigger focus on nutrition now, and also for female and male athletes combined, whereas previously it was always just male centric. I do want to say it's not just a case of like everyone should be just eating, because that the flip side of that is we have a huge obesity and overweight issue in the world. And so it is important to recognize both and acknowledge both, sides of the fence with that. And there is a balance. Okay. And it's all about the individual athlete, what the individual training is, what your goals are, where you sit in that paradigm. So I think that's a really important part of the message as well we want to get across. I think understanding understand why you're doing what you're doing. Did you get into whatever the sport is for health reasons? Did you get into it for performance reasons? Why are you doing what you're doing at this point in time? In Elizabeth's case, she started seeing, aesthetic reasons for why she was starting to underfuel, and she just was fueled in that sense to, continue down that path. Whereas with Danny, it sort of existed before she got into the sport, and then sport was like the release, but it wasn't necessarily the reason why she was doing it. It was just potentially reinforcing it. But then also understand the why. Why do you want to eat? Why do you want to be healthy? Is it because of you want to have a family? you want to have children? Do you want to hang out with your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren? And, you know, come back to why you want to be healthy, I think is a really important aspect of all of this. Fuel for the work required. It's an easy statement, and it's certainly what we base our program on. But if you are doing Ironman, which 1 to 2% of the world does, you're going to need, generally speaking, a fair bit of fuel. Okay. You certainly in season, if you're in season, please don't fast. Don't do like time restricted fasting and stuff like that in season, because you're probably training and your coach is probably giving you a fair bit of volume. And eating, even if it's a small meal before, certainly eating afterwards is going to provide benefit from a health perspective, but also a performance perspective. And then I think, as Danny pointed out, talk to people. The point of today, the point of the campaign with Feisty is to really raise awareness of this. And I think, as Danny pointed out, like just talking to people who have gone through this is really important. And I don't think we should, discount that at all, the importance of talking to each other about it. Fuel with a purpose. I think that's what it all comes back to. Like, yeah, if you're in season, it's about performance. If your coach is asking you to deliver on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, and you're working towards an event, you fuel with a purpose for performance. Just let it go that you've got to be losing weight. You never know. Look, you may end up improving body composition without losing weight anyway, but you're fueling with a purpose to perform. And I think that's really important. If you are going to be in that phase of improvement in body composition and fat loss, just that needs to be conveyed to your coach, that performance will probably reduce, and training needs to be appropriate to what that looks like if you are going into a caloric deficit. But understand that you still don't want to be starving yourself. It is a graded and it is a controlled manner. But the goal of what you're aiming for, or the purpose of what you're trying to do, is a very important part. Your session details obviously are taken into account, and this is what we're thinking about when we're delivering the program. So what is the type of training? Is it bike run? Is it brick? How long is it? What's the intensity? Those 3 key factors are going to impact the amount of fuel that you're giving yourself before, during, and after, and the type of fuel that you're going to be consuming. And then, as we said there, that's where it comes down to the appropriate fueling. So you're understanding pre-session, in-session, and post-session, those types and those amounts. And that's a lot of decision-making for a lot of people to do. So certainly what we're trying to do, and what we are doing with the Fuelin program, is providing that level of detail and removing that decision paralysis, so you can focus on just eating first and foremost, and eating the right amounts, but focus on your training. And these are just some parameters that, that we tend to talk about with athletes, so you can get an inkling of why certain meals may be getting given to you. But certainly, if a session is less than 60 minutes, it's always one of those ones. Look, can you do it fasted? Yes, you probably can. Do you need to do it fasted? No. If you don't have time to eat something, okay. The important point is going to be that you're either eating during or afterwards. You can certainly consider, in a less than 60 minute, also eating something as simple as a banana, something as simple as toast. For me, toast is always, people go searching for all these miracle or miraculous sort of pre-session meals, and it's like, just eat some toast and have some jam or some nut butter on it. It will serve you a purpose. So you don't have to be elaborate with your pre-session fueling. Just think that you probably do need to eat something. And certainly when it gets over 60 minutes, you're certainly considering taking in some carbohydrates, whether that be around 30 grams or not. In terms of the bike, as you go up into further extending the duration, and same with the run, and the intensity starts to pick up, you're certainly going to be picking up the amount of carbohydrates that you're consuming. And certainly anything that's over 3 hours, you most definitely should be eating beforehand, and probably eating a significant amount of carbohydrates when doing that. And post-session fueling, certainly this is just talking about carbohydrates in particular, because we were talking about that low carbohydrate availability has been more recently researched about the negative connotations of reducing carbohydrates post-session training and the negative effect on bone mineral markers. Certainly if it's less than 60 minutes, you still want to consume carbohydrates, but it doesn't have to be a huge amount of carbohydrates. I'm apologizing in advance because I'm just looking at the colors and the colors are reversed there for some reason. And then as you extend the session duration that you've done, you certainly want to be increasing the amount of carbohydrates that you're consuming in those to allow you to perform. Now, if you have secondary sessions on that day, or depending on the type of session the following day, i.e. duration, extent and duration and intensity, that is going to have a significant impact on the amount of food that you should be eating on that day. And again, that's what Fuelin is doing, is taking away that need for you to calculate the amounts of food you need and just supply you in a very easy color so you can understand the types of carbs you require. In terms of how Fuelin works, and I know quite a lot of you are actually already on the program, so I don't need to explain this too much, but it does sync with Training Peaks today's plan and final surge. It syncs to give your coach's training plan a mirrored image in terms of the food plan. So you can see on the right, the screenshots, that's a very condensed view, just a quick overview of what it would look like. So you can quickly see, okay, you're doing a fairly low intensity bike ride, but you are going to be consuming a yellow snack, i.e. 50 grams of carbs beforehand. It looks like it's a brick. It's a short run off the bike, so that's not going to be fueled. You're then going to have, it looks like a snack, which is a high protein snack, because there's no color with that, and then having a green breakfast, so around 100 grams of carbs to completely refuel after that. The second screenshot would be a more detailed view of what you would be reading, with key considerations of what to eat during the sessions. And the last screen right behind is a screenshot from today's plan, where you could click on the session and go back to today's plan. There is the ability to track within the app. So if you want to track within the app, there are hundreds of meals. You can also track using MyFitnessPal or Lose It, and it syncs seamlessly with it. We also push very hard on athletes understanding their sweat rates and their carbohydrate capacity. We're big believers in high carbohydrate fueling for race pace and high intensity sessions, and athletes practicing that in training in order to perfect their race fueling strategy. And then I think above all, probably the thing that we enjoy most as coaches is holding these Q&A sessions on a weekly basis and ensuring that, questions are answered. I know we've gone over time. Apologies. It's a big topic to talk about, and I just want to thank Feisty for being on board with this as well. And certainly I'd just like to thank Danny and Elizabeth again for being so open and vulnerable, for sharing their experience. And if there's any questions, happy to answer them. If not, I will be quiet, and we can all have a great evening. Just an hour and a half. So, yeah, look, if anyone's got any questions, happy to answer them now and stay on. I know it's a fairly, and if anyone would like to turn on their cameras, it's always very nice for me to look at some faces as opposed to, black squares. But I know it's a difficult topic to cover, and hopefully it has resonated with, the athletes who have joined today and will be watching this on replay. Cool. Okay. Well, no one's got any questions, so we can safely say we'll close it off. Oh, there's and Jonathan just put up, there is a link there that can take you to anyone who's joined the session today can click on that link, and that will give them 20% off their first month. That may be a benefit to them. Hello, Sarah.
Hey, Scott. Thank you.
It's all right. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good. How was it? Was it okay?
Yeah, it's good. That was very informative. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's
Thank
good. I think I'm looking forward to hearing your session with Danny from last night. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet.
It comes out tomorrow morning.
Perfect.
So we were just
Wow.
picking the clips for what we're going to put on the reels for when we're pushing it out. So
Yeah, perfect.
fun.
Did you have any questions from today? I know you're probably well across this. So,
Oh, I don't really have questions, but I definitely wish, like, I can look back and go, oh yeah, I was like at certain stages, like chronically underfueled, and we talked about it with Danny yesterday, and I talked about it on the podcast last week, like all the different times we used to try all these nutrition strategies, like try doing fasted training, try eating only fats while you're on a 6-hour bike ride, like, and then wonder like why the hell like the training's not taking,
why you felt terrible,
and then why am I not recovering, and why did the race go so badly, like it's just, and that's part of being an elite athlete, is you're always trying to be at the forefront and like try something new, whatever, but like sort of like maybe focus more on the actual training and recovery and not so much on like how we're manipulating our diets to be smaller. So
yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that's what the Norwegians are really highlighting at the moment with their training, is like the training will only adapt if we provide the fuel to allow adaptation.
Right.
And they're not worried about burning more fat, because they're like, when it comes to a race, I'm going really fast. And physiology dictates that if you're going really fast, you're using carbohydrates as a primary fuel source. And it's like, so therefore they're fueling appropriately to what the training is and what the racing is going to replicate. And that's where I think it's fascinating. Like people are so still obsessed with this fat oxidation notion.
And even like before that, we came even from like almost like a carbohydrate obsession, where it was like, I remember being told to eat way more carbs than was needed when I first started, and I changed my diet from like a more balanced proteins and fat. It was like the low fat thing. Right. And then I started to have blood sugar issues, that I never had before. So it's super interesting. You like watch these phases go through sports nutrition.
And it's fascinating you still say it, because I still look at, and this is like, I think the recommendations for carbohydrate fueling, like on a day-to-day basis, need to be reviewed, because it's very confusing for athletes. It's like, if you do 8 hours of training, you need to be eating 7 grams of carbs, like, and you need to be eating 3 grams per kilo body weight after every session. It's like, whoa, do you? Like, I don't know if you do. And what types of carbohydrates are you eating? Like, you don't need to be eating Cheerios like after every session. Like, you can eat vegetables like potatoes and roast potato and sweet potato and stuff like that. But balance it with, as you said, protein. And balance it with good quality fats. And I think you're right. Like, it's always so separate, isn't it? It's like low fat, high carb, high fat, low carb, protein, often forgotten.
Yeah, totally.
Like, and then I think we're sort of had a little bit of a renaissance in this as well. It's like, oh no, everyone should just eat a hell of a lot of protein and don't worry about carbs and fats. And it's like, well, they all work together. So
yeah. No, it's just so interesting, but
it is interesting.
Hopefully we'll get back to fueled first and then worry about everything else later.
And I think it's just getting the buy-in too. I hear this, I felt it. An athlete I've been working with, she's like, until you start fueling well, you don't know how good you can actually feel. Like, and so it's so hard to initially get people and kind of convince them, yes, you need to properly fuel. Like, just trust me a little. Just trust me a little, and then you'll start feeling better. And then, so it's just a matter of changing the message enough that's out there. To getting them to try it and to pay attention to it, and then stick with it long enough, as Scott and I have talked about. It's not this overnight thing. Stick with it long enough that you're like, wow, this last month I have been recovering and training better than I ever have. It's not just like one, a lot of people go, oh, I had some carbohydrates yesterday, or, oh, I finally ate enough calories yesterday, I should feel amazing today. No, give it a little time, stick with it, be consistent. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it is the
We'll get there.
consistency.
Yeah, I like that. Just believe me a little bit. Yeah.
I that's like, it's a running joke. I'm like, just a little, just give me something, hold on to a piece.
You joke about that, Sarah, but it is ongoing. I can't tell you how often we're questioned about stuff, and it's cool to question it, but it's like, just trust a little bit. Like, you know, I'm not trying to get you fat. Like, you know,
I'm trying
like,
to sabotage your
yeah,
performance.
I'm not trying to sabotage your
Yeah.
health and your performance. Like, I'm trying to help you, but hey, you know, and you're the one paying me. So,
Yeah, totally. And the other thing, like, I think we often ignore is that there is like an emotional side to eating, you
Correct.
know, where people like the like being that feeling of being hungry, really hungry, and then eating, you know, and if you're fueling properly, you don't have as big as those big dips too, right? And so it's not just like physiological, it's also like this, you have to let go of that emotional side of like, I'm going to be able to, you know, if I get really, really hungry, then I can eat this massive plate of the, but like, I find if I'm fueling properly, I'm like not hungry enough. Like I just want a normal portion because I've already fueled properly through the day. Right.
And
so,
that's the danger of fasting. Is that can be something that actually occurs, and that an overeating of portions has been shown as well. Especially in the long term, where you tend to overeat in that sense. So yeah, it's funny going through all these things. I think I certainly don't love feeling really hungry. Like, I think it's the worst thing in the world. So yeah, I'd rather just be on an even keel, that's for sure. So.
Totally. And I think there's like, so we could talk about this forever, but there's definitely like forms of like emotion that come, or like euphoria that come both with being extremely hungry and with being extremely full sometimes, or good or bad emotions too, like, or negative. So
and you hear people talk about that in a positive way as well. Like you'll hear people talking about fasting, for instance, and it will heighten sensations, it will heighten brain activity. It's like, maybe that's because it's an evolutionary thing and it was trying to keep you alive to hunt down an animal, but like, you know, is that a really positive aspect now? I don't know. Like,
or like
again,
in the context
it's that balance
of
between well, this is the thing, it's all context, isn't it? It's like, are we talking about cognitive performance sitting at your desk and not overeating because you're actually not expending any energy, and you don't need to overeat because you're not doing anything, versus you're training for an Ironman and fasting and feeling cognitively alert? Give a shit. Like, you'll probably feel cognitive alert if you can actually focus because you've taken in enough energy and you can ride your bike really well. Like, so that's it. I think context gets lost a lot in the world of nutrition. People just apply, you know, they see a research paper and they're like, oh, it's got to work. You know, they lost all this weight and they felt better, and it's like they were
it was 6 overweight men that do no kind of endurance sports, like they just put them on a, you know, like, no, that doesn't work for everybody.
Exactly. So anyway, look, I know we've gone way over time as per usual, but Sarah, a really cool initiative, and I think it's one of those ones I'm sure we'll probably revisit. I think it's not like done and dusted.
It's not a 2-week conversation.
I was going to say, it's not a 2-week conversation. I think it's a highlight period, like, you know, throughout the year, about like keep reminding people about it, and addressing the very difficult and very complicated topic of, you know, nutrition and energy intake and getting it right, and not overdoing it, not underdoing it. Like just, you know, as you say, fueling to be fueled, I guess. So, cool. Okay. We'll end it there.
Cool. Well, thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Jay jumped off. I was hoping he could stay on. We'll jump on. I'll just send a different link. We'll stop recording.